pawn e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, pawn c3, bishop b6, pawn d4, queen e7, castles kingside, knight f6, pawn d5, knight b8, bishop d3, pawn d6, knight b1, d2, pawn a6, knight c4, bishop a7, pawn a4, castles kingside, pawn b4, knight e8, queen c2, pawn g6, bishop h6, knight g7, knight e3, pawn f6, rook a1, e1, rook f7, king h1, knight d7, pawn g4, knight f8, rook t1, bishop takes e3, pawn takes e3, bishop d7, rook g3, pawn c6, bishop c4, pawn takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop e6, rook e1, t1, rook c8, knight h4, bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, rook c7, knight f5, pawn takes f5, pawn takes f5, queen e8, queen g2, queen d7, rook takes g7, rook takes g7, bishop takes g7, queen takes g7, queen c2, knight g6, pawn takes g6, pawn h6, queen f5, queen f8, pawn c4, king g7, rook c1, pawn b6, pawn e4, queen e7, queen f2, rook b7, pawn h4, pawn a5, pawn h5, pawn takes b4, rook b1, pawn b3, rook takes b3, queen d7, queen f5, queen e7, queen e6, queen c7, queen f7, queen takes f7, pawn takes f7, rook a7, rook takes b6, rook takes a4, rook takes d6, rook takes c4, rook takes f6, king f8, pawn d6, rook takes e4, pawn d7, rook d4, rook takes h6, king takes f7, rook h8,